Hey everybody, welcome to the last part of the digestive tract, which is the large intestine. And here we are looking at the large intestine. And there's three different parts to the large intestine. There's the cecum, the colon, and the rectum. But before we get into those different parts, I want to point out that by the time food reaches the large intestine, almost all of the nutrient digestion and absorption has already occurred. Most of that occurs in the small intestine. So that's not really a large concern by the time it gets to the large intestine. So what is the job of the large intestine? Well, the large intestine, when it receives this indigestible food material, is going to absorb remaining water. It's going to absorb remaining electrolytes. And all the while, it's going to be compacting this indigestible food material into a semi-solid state that we call a feces, that we call a stool. So it's basically preparing this indigestible food material to be eliminated from the body through a process called defecation. So let's look at the different parts of the large intestine. The first part of the large intestine that's going to receive this indigestible food material, it's going to receive the chyme, is called the cecum. This is the cecum right here. And the cecum, again, is going to receive this chyme from the small intestine, specifically from the ileum. But for that chyme to pass from the ileum into the cecum, it has to go through a sphincter, not surprisingly. And we call this sphincter the ileocecal valve. Ileo referring to the ileum, cecal referring to the cecum. And so it's the job of the cecum to receive this material, receive this chyme from the small intestine, and it's going to begin the compaction process. The next part of the large intestine, which is the largest component, is the colon. And we have the ascending colon, we have the transverse colon, we have the descending colon, and then lastly we have the sigmoid colon. And the sigmoid colon is kind of S-shaped, and it moves posteriorly back toward the rectum, and that's it. That's the colon. And if you notice, the colon is broken up into these individual pouches that we call haustra. The haustra are these individual pouches. And this indigestible food material is going to spend a lot of time in these haustra. So what's going to happen in there? Well, what's going to happen is that material within the haustra is going to be pinched back and forth. So the indigestible food material is going to be pinched, it's going to be separated, and it's going to be pushed against the walls of the haustra. And this all occurs because of the smooth muscle layers, the muscularis externa, in the large intestine wall. And this process is what we call haustral churning. It's a form of segmentation, pinching the food, mixing the food together, and rubbing it against the wall of the haustra. So the question is, what is the benefit of this? What does this haustral churning do? What does this movement of the food material within the haustra do? Well, one, it's going to make it into a homogeneous mass. It's going to mix everything together. Another thing that it's going to do, because it's rubbing it against this wall, is it's going to allow for water and electrolyte absorption. It's going to allow time for that kind of absorption, and it's physically moving the material against the wall so that absorption can occur back into the blood. And then lastly, all this mixing together, all this churning together is going to help compact the indigestible food material and prepare it into a feces. And that's the main job. Those are the main jobs of the colon. And food is going to spend quite a bit of time in the colon just doing that, 10 hours plus, absorbing water and preparing that feces. Then we get down into the last portion, which is the rectum. And the rectum is basically a storage pouch. It's expandable and it stores the feces until we're able to defecate that. And that feces is actually going to back up sometimes past the rectum into the sigmoid colon and perhaps even up into the descending colon as well. And then the last part of the rectum is the anal canal and the anus. And we're going to talk about the nervous system involvement that goes on down here at the rectum and the nervous system control of what we call the defecation reflex. But guess what? Stretch of that rectum is going to trigger that defecation reflex and the process of eliminating that feces from the body. And I guess one last thing that I want to point out here, going back to the cecum, back on the posteromedial side of the cecum, on the back middle portion of the cecum, we have this little appendage. What's that little appendage back there? That's the appendix. And the appendix does not have a digestive function, but rather it has an immune function. The appendix is what we call lymphoid tissue, which means it's full of a lot of different immune cells, white blood cells. And basically what it's doing is it's providing immune surveillance. This chyme is coming into the large intestine, and the appendix gives the immune system an opportunity to surveil that chyme and to see if there's any pathogens or any other microorganisms in there that we should be concerned about. And this next page basically just summarizes a lot of the anatomy that I just talked about. Here's some really nice text describing the anatomy, overall anatomy of the large intestine. And then these are kind of just some of the individual points that I included about the individual parts. Here we talk about the cecum, collecting and storing material. Then we get into the colon. And then lastly, we get into the rectum. So like I mentioned, the major digestive function of the large intestine is to absorb most of the remaining water and electrolytes. And that's basically what this figure in this text is showing you. This is a nice little figure and some nice text that we should go ahead and read. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Most nutrients have been digested and absorbed into the blood by the time they reach the end of the small intestine. The remaining undigested chyme passes through the ileocecal sphincter and into the large intestine. Two opposing processes, absorption and secretion, occur. Absorption is the movement of nutrients from the large intestine into the blood and then into the cells. Remaining to be absorbed in the large intestine are some electrolytes, water, and vitamins. Absorption and secretion take place in the ascending and transverse colon. The remaining undigestible material is compacted into a semi-solid mixture called feces, stored temporarily in the descending and sigmoid colon, and finally ejected from the body. And that's what this figure up here is showing us. So the major job of the large intestine is to absorb most of the remaining water. And here we go. There's the water moving from the large intestine into the blood, and it's doing that via osmosis. Here we have sodium, and we're taking that sodium and moving it back into the blood. So that's the reabsorption of both water and sodium. Now, with regards to secretion, it's showing that we have potassium in the blood and that we can move potassium in the blood back into the large intestine. And I'm not too sure about the details regarding this, but I would imagine it has something to do with potassium homeostasis in the blood. If potassium levels are too high, then we can secrete some of that potassium from the blood and secrete it back into the large intestine, and then it'll get eliminated in the feces. And then you can also see here we have feces backing up into the sigmoid colon and also into the descending colon. Here we're looking at 3 different types of motility that occur in the large intestine. And all of these are being driven by the muscularis externa, the layers of smooth muscle in the large intestine wall. And the first type of motility is what we call segmentation or haustral churning. And I'll go ahead and just read about that. It says, as undigested material enters the haustra, the expansion triggers muscularis layer contractions that pinch the haustra into separate compartments and turn the contents inside. This serves to enhance absorption and secretion of water and electrolytes, as well as to propel the contents to the next haustra. So this is that haustral churning we're talking about, getting moved back and forth between haustra, making it into a homogeneous mass, rubbing it against the wall so we can get the absorption of water and electrolytes, and also contributing to the compaction process. The next type of motility is peristalsis. And remember that peristalsis occurs all the way down through the digestive tract, beginning at the esophagus. From the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, peristalsis is occurring. And I'll just go ahead and read about this. Stimulation of the muscularis layer by stretch results in a weak rhythmic wave of contraction, a combination of pinching the circular layer and shortening the longitudinal layer. This contraction combination results in the gradual propulsion of undigested material through the digestive tract. And so it's this slow movement, these slow movements of the muscularis layer that's going to slowly and continually move that food through the digestive tract. And then lastly, we have mass movements. And a mass movement, this strong muscle contraction forces fecal material into the rectum. It's regulated by a reflex and occurs 2 to 3 times a day on average, maybe more, maybe less. And it's this mass movement, these strong contractions that move feces through the colon. And, there can be chemicals that stimulate this as well, maybe caffeine, for instance. And when I see all of this motility, all of this activity of the muscularis layer, I immediately think of the enteric nervous system. What does the enteric nervous system mean to you? What is the enteric nervous system? Well, the enteric nervous system is its own separate nervous system built into the wall of the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract. And it's driving a lot of this motility, especially when it comes to peristalsis. Yes, there is coordination with the autonomic nervous system, but the enteric nervous system is largely involved in regulating this motility process, oftentimes independent of other parts of the nervous system. Here we have some histology of the large intestine, and it looks different than the small intestine. In the small intestine, you have these finger-like projections called villi, which serve to increase surface area, but we don't have those here. Instead, what we have, this is the lumen, so that's where the chyme is going to pass through, And instead of having villi, we have these distinct, what we call crypts. So these indentations of the, or depressions of the large intestine wall. And this is the epithelium that is lining those crypts. And guess what? That is a simple columnar epithelium, just like the stomach and just like the small intestine. But another thing that you see there that really stands out are all of these kind of white, clear balloons, I guess, or bubbles that are lining the crypts, that are interspersed between the epithelium. And what are those? Well, those are goblet cells. And those goblet cells, if we read down below, those goblet cells are going to produce copious amounts of mucus. They're going to produce a whole lot of mucus that is going to line the lumen of the large intestine. And this is going to provide important lubrication as this undigested waste is compacted. All right, so I have a question for you. We have all this motility going on that's moving this material through the large intestine. What happens if this material is rushed through the large intestine? Okay, this occurs too quickly. Food does not spend enough time in the large intestine. Well, if that's the case, then there's not going to be enough time for adequate water reabsorption. And so there's going to be a large amount of water in the stool. And that's a condition called diarrhea, where feces are discharged from the bowels frequently in a liquid form. And so there's lots of different pharmaceuticals that can help with this. And one of those is Imodium, and the active ingredient in Imodium is loperamide. And this basically works by slowing down intestinal motility. It's working on the muscle, smooth muscle, presumably, to slow the movement of material through the large intestine and therefore give more time for water reabsorption. What if the opposite occurs? What if movement through the large intestine is too slow? So material is spending too much time in the large intestine. Well, if that's the case, then you're going to get too much water reabsorption, and the feces is going to become hardened. And this can result in a condition called constipation, where there's difficulty emptying the bowels. And this can be caused by a number of things. A lack of dietary fiber. Fiber is important to increase the bulk of the stool to help it move through. So it can be due to a lack of dietary fiber, lack of exercise, being emotionally upset, or long-term laxative abuses. And there's a whole bunch of different types of laxatives. And one of those categories of laxatives are called stimulant laxatives. And basically what those do is they stimulate contraction of the intestinal muscles. So they're stimulating that smooth muscle to try to work that material through and out of the large intestine. And that brings us to the last part of our digestive tract journey, which is defecation. Eliminating feces, indigestible food material, from the body. And not surprisingly, this is going to be under nervous system control. It's under the control of what we call the defecation reflex. And most of this is involuntary and involves the autonomic nervous system. But So let's identify the different parts of this defecation reflex. And the first thing that we need to do is identify the sensory stimulation. With the reflex loop, it always begins with some sort of sensory information. So what is the sensory stimulus in this particular instance? And maybe just take a second and orient yourself with the picture. Take a look at here and read through it and try to figure out what's going on. All right, so what is the sensory stimulation for the defecation reflex? Well, the sensory stimulation is going to be stretch of the large intestine wall, stretch of the sigmoid colon, and stretch of the rectum. When feces enters the sigmoid colon, the wall of the sigmoid colon stretches, and that activates stretch receptors. That stretch information is then taken via sensory neurons. Where's that going? It's going to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to be the integrator in this instance. The spinal cord is going to unconsciously decide what to do, but not really decide because it's already built into a reflex loop. So what happens next? What color should I choose? We have the sensory component, the sensory neurons. Integration occurs in the spinal cord. Then we have to activate the motor neurons that are going to actually do something about this response, that are going to allow for the defecation reflex to take place, for feces to be eliminated from the body. So let's follow those motor neurons. Here's a motor neuron right here. And where's it going? It's going down here to this smooth muscle that wraps around the anal canal that we call the internal anal sphincter. And this is smooth muscle. And by default, this sphincter is closed. So what do you think these motor neurons are going to tell that smooth muscle to do? They're going to tell it to relax. So you're going to get relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. And that's going to open up the anal canal and allow that feces to be eliminated from the body. Now this motor neuron that I just pointed out, this is part of the autonomic nervous system. This motor neuron is part of the autonomic nervous system. And as you know, there's two different components to the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And my question is, which one of these is this motor neuron in the defecation reflex? Is this a sympathetic motor neuron or a parasympathetic motor neuron? And the answer to that is parasympathetic. The parasympathetic nervous system is involved in periods of relaxation, resting, digesting. And so it's going to be the parasympathetic motor neurons that go down and relax this internal anal sphincter. Now, do we have any control over this? Do we have any control over the defecation process? And the answer to that is yes, we do have a little bit of control. And that control comes from another sphincter called the external anal sphincter that are on both sides of the anal canal. The difference here, though, is that the external anal sphincter is skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle can be consciously controlled. So we can send impulses from our brain, from the cerebral cortex, which travel down this motor neurons and cause contraction of the external anal sphincter. And basically what you're doing here is you're puckering your bunghole. To have no other better way to put that, you're puckering your bunghole there. And that closes off the anus and gives you a little bit of control, buys you a little bit of time for when defecation is convenient and you can consciously relax that external anal sphincter. Now, why is it that babies poop their pants? Why is it that babies do not have any control over when they defecate? Well, the answer to that is that it takes time for us to figure out that we have control over this external anal sphincter. It takes time for us to figure out the different skeletal muscles we have control over. And this just hasn't occurred in the infant stage. And these next few slides then are just some special topics related to the large intestine that I don't necessarily know a whole lot about, but I'm interested in finding more about. And I'm also interested in hearing from you all if you have a lot of exposure to this, being in the allied health field, as I imagine you do. And the first one is diverticulitis. So first of all, a diverticulosis is an abnormal pocket or outpouching of the large intestine, is what a diverticulosis is. And most of the time, this is asymptomatic. It doesn't result in any symptoms. But there is the possibility that these pouches become infected, in which case it results in diverticulitis, inflammation of these diverticula. The next is colon cancer, cancer of the colon and also the rectum, which is a deadly form of cancer. And another interesting, unfortunate part about it, something that needs to be addressed, is that colorectal cancer disproportionately affects the Black community in the United States. There's a higher risk of getting colorectal cancer and a higher risk of dying of colorectal cancer than any other ethnic group in the United States. And a lot of this has to do with access to healthcare and socioeconomic status. But interestingly enough, Black individuals who live in Africa, Africans, do not necessarily have a high rate of colorectal cancer like they do in the United States. And so that points to a lot of different things. It can point to diet. There could be a genetic component, the response to the diet. And also certainly there are socioeconomic status issues involved and access to healthcare. And lastly, the last topic has to do with the bacteria called Clostridium difficile or difficile. And these bacteria are actually a normal part of the gut microbiome in the large intestine. But what can happen is that if the normal gut flora is altered, for example, if you take an antibiotic, it can wipe out most or all of the gut microbiome. And what that does is it allows these C. diff bacteria to then flourish, to overpopulate the colon. And that can result in a lot of uncomfortable digestive issues. These are, they're producing toxins, they're causing diarrhea, they're causing all sorts of different and uncomfortable digestive issues. And again, I imagine this is something that you might see in the healthcare field. And it also relates back to the gut microbiome video that we watched and the possibility of taking poop pills to combat this. So the question is, if you had to reestablish, if you had a C. diff infection in your colon and one of the solutions was to repopulate the colon with beneficial bacteria, and you do that by swallowing 30 or 40 poop pills, would you do that? And I think if you're in that situation and you're experiencing all those digestive symptoms, then that may kind of help make that decision for you. And the last thing I want to talk about and spend a little bit of time on is what's called the gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome refers to the millions and millions of bacteria and other microorganisms that live inside the lumen of the digestive tract, especially the small intestine and especially the large intestine. And I'll just go ahead and read a little bit about that. It says, we share a mutually beneficial relationship with the various bacteria that live inside the large intestine. We provide them with a warm environment and food to live and reproduce, and they make vitamins for us that we can't make on our own, such as vitamin K and B complex vitamins. And I want to talk about this because there's a lot of research coming out that's illustrating the importance of a healthy gut microbiome and the different physiological and pathological effects that can have throughout the body. And so I made a list of all the important things that the gut microbiome is doing. And by the way, you may say, well, how are these bacteria getting in the large intestine? How do they get there? Well, the digestive tract is an open body cavity. It's a mucous membrane, so they can colonize the gut through the anus, or if they make their way into the oral cavity and they survive the acidic environment of the stomach, then they can make their way down into the intestines as well. So one of the things that the gut microbiome does, these microorganisms do, is they consume carbohydrates that we're unable to digest. So they're consuming indigestible carbohydrates. And this is basically their food source that they're using. Okay, so that's one of the things they do down there. And as a byproduct of this consumption, they're producing gases. And we can be quite familiar with these gases that can come from this gut microbiome. Another important thing they're doing that I showed on the previous slide is they're synthesizing vitamins that we can't necessarily synthesize on our own, including some of the B vitamins, B1, B2, and B12. They're also synthesizing vitamin K, which is important for producing clotting proteins. And again, this diagram up here is just showing that. Here you have bacteria, and they're making these vitamin Ks and the B complex vitamins, and those are moving from the large intestine into the blood. And then the next few slides just have to do with a lot of the research that's coming out and a lot of the complex mechanisms that these gut microbiomes are involved in. So one of the things that they're finding is that the gut microbiome has positive, beneficial interactions with local immune cells. If I can maybe draw a diagram here. This is the large intestine. And here we have the mucus layer of the large intestine. This is the lumen. And then we get into the wall of the large intestine. And the first layer is the mucosa layer of the large intestine. And you have epithelial cells, that line the intestine. And then underneath that is where you have the lamina propria. You have the areolar connective tissue that supports the epithelium. And so when it comes to the gut microbiome is found in this mucus layer in the lumen. So this is where you're going to find the gut microbiome. And then, as you also know, there's more white blood cells found in the gut than anywhere else in the body. And where are these found? Well, they're found right in this connective tissue right below the epithelium. And so what they're finding is that there's positive beneficial interactions between the gut microbiome and the immune cells below that. And that's become a pretty important area of research. And this is a recent research article that came out about this, and I'll let you read the abstract about it. And you do have access to this PDF article on the Canvas page. And this is a figure that came from that research article. And, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on here. But the title of it is Intestinal Microbiota, Immunity Interplay in Homeostasis. And so a healthy gut microbiome, what they're getting at, a healthy gut microbiome is important for a healthy immune environment as well. And just to orient ourselves, this is the lumen of the large intestine. Here we would have a mucus layer. And then these are all different types of bacteria and whatnot that are found, that are part of the gut microbiome. And here we have the epithelial cells lining the large intestine. And then in the area right below that is the connective tissue layer of the mucous membrane, what we call the lamina propria. That's the areolar tissue right underneath the epithelial cells. And this is where we find the gut. When I say the gut has more white blood cells than anywhere else in the body, well, most of those are located right down under here in this connective tissue. So again, what they're finding out is that there's interplay between the gut microbiome and the immune cells below it, and that they're both required for a nice, healthy gut homeostasis. Another thing that the gut microbiome may be important in is the maintenance of intestinal epithelial health. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the health of these epithelial cells that line the large intestine. And it's critical that these epithelial cells be healthy for the overall health of the organism. But one thing that really needs to be considered is that, remember that these epithelial cells are linked together by tight junctions. And those tight junctions prevent large organisms or large particles, relatively large particles and other microbiota from getting from the lumen down into the connective tissue. And so that they're showing that there's crosstalk between the gut microbiome and these epithelial cells. And again, this is important for overall health of the digestive lining, but overall digestive health as well. And again, there's a couple pieces of this abstract that you might want to read and find interesting. Here's another article. This is the role of the intestinal epithelium in its interaction with the gut microbiome and the effects that that can have on food allergy. And lastly, and very interestingly, they're showing that the gut microbiome may have an influence on the brain and brain health. So what's going on in the gut could have an effect on what's going on in the brain. And you may ask, well, how does that work? How does what's going on in the gut, how does that communicate with what's going on in the brain? And these are some possible pathways by which this interaction may occur, what they call the gut-brain axis. In the first scenario here, number 1, it says that microbes interact with immune cells in the gut, prompting the cells to make cytokines that circulate from the blood to the brain. So the gut microbiome, let's see, this is the lumen of the large intestine out here. And so here we have, this is all different parts of the gut microbiome. And what they're saying is the gut microbiome is interacting with these immune cells that we find in the connective tissue of the mucosal layer. That causes the immune cells to produce these chemicals that are called cytokines, which can get into the blood and make their way up to the brain and interact with the brain. The second thing that might be going on is that these microbes are interacting with epithelial cells of the gut called enteroendocrine cells. And maybe you remember that term, but enteroendocrine cells are cells found in the intestines that actually produce hormones, or what they're calling neuroactive molecules in this part. And what they're saying is that, again, the gut microbiome can interact with these enteroendocrine cells. These enteroendocrine cells produce these molecules as a response, and then these molecules can actually enter the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, and they can follow that cranial nerve all the way back up to the brain and gain access to the brain that way, these neuroactive chemicals. A third mechanism that is being proposed is that the microbes, these microbes are producing molecules on their own. They're producing neurotransmitters and they're producing metabolites. And these products get into the blood and they circulate up into the brain, and some of them may be small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier and actually make their way up into the brain. So that's a third way that they can get up there as well. And again, this is an emerging area of research, but there's a lot of potential implications between a healthy gut microbiome and a healthy brain. And abnormalities in the gut microbiome may be linked to pathology related to the brain. And they're starting to make some connections between the gut microbiome and neurological conditions such as Parkinson's disease or autism. And again, it's an emerging area of research, but it's a really, really kind of exciting and important area of research. And you guys have access to all of these PDF research articles on the Canvas page. And this is something that if you want to talk more about in class, then that'd be really exciting to do that.